The most dangerous thing in a crisis is not always losing value. Sometimes it is losing access. That is a distinction most people do not think about until the day it matters. They think about net worth, they think about balances, they think about whether the account went up or down this quarter. They think about what an asset is worth, if sold under normal conditions in a normal world. They think very little about something more fundamental. Who must keep saying yes before that asset can still function like my property? That is the question that matters in a true emergency. Not because I enjoy dramatic thinking. I do not. I have spent most of my life trying to stay away from drama. But I have also spent most of my life studying systems, incentives, balance sheets, and human nature. An asset you control is very different from an asset you merely access by permission. Most people do not learn that until too late. They imagine ownership in a very naive way. They assume that if the number is on the statement, the money is theirs. If the gold is in the box, it is theirs. If the equity sits in the house, it is theirs. If the retirement balance grows every year, it is theirs. If the digital coins appear in the app, they are theirs. In calm years, that assumption feels good enough. In stressed years, the difference between legal title, beneficial control, administrative access, custodian dependence, and actual usable liquidity becomes painfully clear. That is why I want to talk to you about something the culture does not teach well. Permission risk. The great majority of modern wealth is not held in a form that is instantly self-directed. It sits inside institutions. Banks, brokerages, custodians, retirement wrappers, tax structures, platforms, digital exchanges, county records, clearing systems, government rules. Some of those institutions are sound. Some are not. That is not my main point. My point is that even sound institutions become choke points when a system is under stress. And once a choke point exists, the question is no longer only whether you are rich or poor, bullish or bearish, conservative or aggressive. The question becomes much simpler. What do you really control and what do you only seem to control, as long as the people in charge continue honoring the arrangement without interruption? That is a much harsher question. It is also a much more useful one. I learned early that the world can change the rules on owners faster than owners expect. People think confiscation always arrives with boots shouting and obvious villainy. Sometimes it does. Very often it arrives with paperwork, an order, a policy, a temporary measure, an emergency framework, a revised interpretation, a public interest argument, a stabilization program, a lawful process. That is what makes it dangerous. The more respectable the language, the easier it is for ordinary people to miss what is happening. They think the rules are being adjusted. What is really happening is that the border between your property and the system's authority is being renegotiated under pressure. And pressure makes governments creative. I do not say that as ideology, I say it as history. When a state gets cornered by debt, war, banking stress, social unrest, inflation, or energy disruption, it does not begin by asking what abstract property principle would make philosophers smile. It begins by asking what sources of control are reachable. That is how systems behave. The public likes to imagine the government as either perfectly protective or cartoonishly malicious. Real governments are more ordinary and therefore more dangerous than both fantasies. They are incentive machines. They go where the pressure pushes them. If tax receipts weaken, if interest costs explode, if banking stress appears, if confidence in the currency wobbles, or if political leaders decide that visible action is preferable to honest restraint, they start looking very hard at every pool of capital and every system through which capital moves. That is not paranoia. It is the oldest reflex in public finance. The reason ordinary savers get hurt is not that they are foolish. It is that they keep believing normal administration and emergency administration are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Normal times reward convenience. Emergency times reward control. Those are different architectures. And if you build your financial life entirely around convenience, then you are often much more fragile than you realize. Let me begin with a story that stayed with me because it captures the point so clearly. A woman sells an apartment, places the proceeds in a bank, and goes to sleep, believing she has chosen safety. That is the important detail. She did not go to a casino. She did not chase a meme stock. She did not buy a dubious private deal. She did what ordinary, respectable people are taught to do. She put money in the bank. Then the system changes, the bank doors close. A legal mechanism appears. A percentage vanishes. Suddenly the word safe has to be reconsidered. People hear stories like that and comfort themselves immediately. That happened there, not here. That happened then, not now. That was a small country, a strange case, a temporary emergency, a foreign system, an isolated event. Fine. But the lesson is not geographic. The lesson is structural. What you called money was partly a relationship with an institution. Once that institution entered a rescue framework, you discovered the relationship had terms you had not really studied. That is the lesson. A similar lesson was taught in a different form when governments treated privately held gold not as untouchable property, but as a pool of assets relevant to a national emergency and a currency regime. Again, people get lost in the costume. They argue about era, ideology, justification, legal theory, and politics. The practical investor should see the more important truth. If a state considers certain private holdings strategically important in a crisis, your confidence that the asset is yours in the ordinary sense may be much weaker than you imagined. Another example appears in more modern form with digital assets. A great many people were sold a fantasy that a new ledger meant the end of institutional vulnerability. But if the asset lives on a platform, if the identity is linked through a regulated gateway, if access depends on an exchange, if withdrawals can be frozen, if compliance requests can be executed, then the mythology of pure untouchability was always overstated. Technology changed the wrapper. It did not erase the human choke points around entry, exit, and enforcement. These examples differ on the surface. Bank deposits. Gold exchange held digital assets, but beneath them is the same lesson. Do not confuse visibility on a statement with full sovereignty over an asset, and do not confuse legal normality in calm times with guaranteed treatment under stress. That is the mental shift I want people to make. The modern financial world gives us many advantages: liquidity, speed, scale, convenience, yield opportunities, digital mobility, record keeping. It also gives us a seductive illusion that we control everything we can tap on a screen. That is not always true. A screen is a window. Control depends on the legal and institutional machinery behind the window. So if I were trying to prepare a household sensibly, lawfully, and rationally for a world where financial pressure may intensify, I would not begin with apocalyptic fantasies. I would begin with a plain inventory of assets by control type. What do I own directly? What do I own indirectly? What do I own inside a fragile permission system? What do I own through one institution that knows almost everything about me? What do I own that is liquid only if the system remains friendly? What do I own that could become administratively difficult even if its long-term value remains intact? That is the exercise, not fear, classification. The first category I would examine is cash held in banks. People speak about cash in banks as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Often it is not small everyday balances used for ordinary life are one thing. Large concentrations of liquidity in one institution are something else entirely. Your checking account is not merely a pile of money. It is an unsecured claim inside a banking and regulatory framework. That framework is usually fine. Usually is not a sufficient word for serious planning. Here is the problem. A bank account can be touched by far more than market risk. Administrative holds, levies, fraud investigations, compliance reviews, technical system disruptions, bank-specific stress, delays in access, transfer limits, and emergency operating restrictions all live in the same neighborhood. You do not need a full national crisis for a bank balance to become functionally less useful than you expected. Sometimes you simply need the wrong notice, the wrong flag, the wrong institution, or the wrong week. That is why I do not like concentration. If a family keeps all liquid life support in one primary bank because it feels easier, I do not call that prudent. I call it convenient fragility. A household should know the insured limits, respect them, and understand that operational access matters just as much as theoretical coverage. Insurance is helpful. Insurance does not guarantee that disruption will feel smooth. That is an important difference. If one institution became inconvenient for a few days or a few weeks, how does the household function? That is the real question. I want separate channels, separate institutions, separate rails, enough direct liquidity, or near direct liquidity that a single administrative choke point does not instantly turn a normal family into a panicked one. This is not an argument for hoarding paper currency in absurd quantities that creates a different set of problems. It is an argument for redundancy. Redundancy is one of the most intelligent ideas in finance, yet people hate it because it seems inefficient during good times. Good times are when redundancy always looks unnecessary. That is why it is valuable. I want the emergency reserve not just funded, but structured. A portion in an ordinary operating bank, a portion elsewhere. A portion in direct short-term treasury exposure, if appropriate, because direct treasury ownership is not the same as a large uninsured bank balance. A modest amount of immediate access cash for short disruptions, because card systems, branches, and transfer systems do not always behave elegantly under stress. The point is not drama. The point is that the statement balance is not the only relevant dimension. The route of access matters too. Now let us move to the second category, bank house valuables and bank-dependent custody. This is where people make a curious mistake. They recognize some risk in bank cash and then seek safety by moving a different asset into a bank-controlled box. They call this security. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is merely custody risk wearing a better story. A safe deposit box feels reassuring because the word safe is doing a great deal of emotional work. But the important question is not how the box feels. The important question is whether your access to the box is truly sovereign or whether it remains wrapped inside the operating conditions, permissions, investigations, legal interpretations, and physical accessibility of the institution around it. Again, I am not saying nobody should ever use secure third-party storage. Life is more nuanced than that. I am saying people should stop calling something fully under their control when it very obviously depends on a building they do not control, a system they do not control, hours they do not control, and procedures they may not understand until the day they matter. That applies to metals, heirlooms, important documents, and any other asset whose usefulness depends on uncontested access. If an asset is meant to be a resilience asset, then placing it inside the same broader system you are trying to defend against deserves serious thought. I do not need romance here. I need coherence. If you own physical precious metals because you believe in having something outside the paper promise machine, then that logic should extend to the custody question too. If you keep critical legal records because you believe in redundancy, then the record should be stored with a real appreciation for access risk, not simply placed wherever the branding feels secure. Too many people stop thinking one step too early. They solve the first problem and then recreate it through custody. That is not intelligent preparation. That is incomplete thinking. The third category is home equity. This is a much harder topic because people are emotional about houses. They should be. A house is not only an asset. It is where life happened. It is where routines, children, marriages, illnesses, holidays, quiet mornings, and the whole ordinary tenderness of a human life took place. I understand that. But the law often sees something more plain, an identifiable asset with visible equity attached. That matters. A paid-off home feels like freedom. In one sense it is. There is deep psychological strength in owning your shelter free and clear. I admire that instinct, but a house with large visible equity is also something else. It is an asset that can attract attention from liens, judgments, tax pressure, and every other mechanism through which the world notices value sitting in one place. This is why people must distinguish between emotional freedom and legal exposure geometry. I am not telling people to strip equity recklessly or to play games with creditors or the state. I am saying that lazy equity can create a kind of financial stillness that feels comforting, but may be strategically clumsy. A household should understand exactly what protections apply in its state, what homestead or other exemptions exist, how property taxes function, what title structures mean, what insurance does and does not cover, and what legal planning is available through legitimate counsel. That is adult behavior. Ignoring these questions because the mortgage is gone and the emotions feel good is not adult behavior. It is a lullaby. Property tax enforcement, lien processes, assessment disputes, title issues, and local rules are not exciting dinner conversation. That is exactly why most people sleepwalk through them. Then one notice appears, and they discover they never understood the mechanics surrounding the largest visible asset in their life. A wise person studies the mechanics before the notice. The fourth category is retirement assets. This one makes people especially emotional because the numbers are large and the tax advantages are seductive. A person spends decades hearing the same message. Max the retirement account. Take the match. Keep feeding the tax shelter. Build the future. Much of that advice is sound. I have no quarrel with the value of disciplined retirement saving. But the serious investor must still ask a harder question: who writes the rules around this pool of capital? Not once, over time. Retirement accounts are wonderful creatures in one sense. They protect discipline from the daily appetite of the present. They defer taxes or reduce them under existing rules. They accumulate size quietly. All of that is useful. But a retirement account is also one of the most visible, regulated, rule-defined pools of household wealth in the country that matters when fiscal pressures grow. I am not making a melodramatic prediction that tomorrow morning someone seizes every retirement balance. That is not how serious thinking works. Serious thinking asks something else. If public debt burdens intensify, if tax policy changes, if withdrawal rules evolve, if incentives are reworked, if contribution structures are altered, if required distributions become more politically salient, or if governments create soft pressure programs that reshape how retirement assets are encouraged, taxed, or steered, how exposed is the household? That is the question. Retirement wealth is not fake wealth, but it is governed wealth. And governed wealth is not identical to freely controlled wealth. That distinction matters. You should still save for retirement. I certainly would. But I would not build a household plan that pretends every future dollar must remain inside one policy. Sensitive wrapper forever. I want diversification not only of asset class, but of legal and tax architecture, taxable accounts, direct ownership structures, liquid reserves, retirement assets, and real assets all play different roles. Concentration inside one kind of wrapper may feel tidy. Tidy is not always resilient. The fifth category is exchange, held digital wealth and platform-based custody. This is perhaps the most educational category because it taught a whole generation, a lesson it did not want to learn. People loved the language of sovereignty. They loved the language of independence, decentralization, and escape from the old system. Then many of them stored the very assets meant to symbolize independence inside centralized platforms, with names, passwords, compliance teams, withdrawal controls, identity verification, and every ordinary choke point the old world has always known how to pressure. That is not rebellion. That is convenience. Convenience again. Convenience is the silent architect of fragility. If you hold digital assets through a platform, then you do not merely have market risk. You have custody risk, counterparty risk, policy risk, operational risk, identity, linkage risk, withdrawal risk, and potentially legal. Risk spillovers you never bothered to imagine because the app looks so clean. A person who wants to hold digital assets as a serious store of value must decide whether he is an owner or a user of a service. Those are different positions. I am not telling people what to buy. I am telling them that if they hold something they claim is outside the system while relying completely on the system to access it, they have confused symbolism with structure. That confusion is expensive. Now, once we understand these categories, the next step is not fear. It is lawful redesign. This is where I want to be very clear. I am not interested in teaching people to lie. evade lawful obligations, hide assets illegally, or behave as if private cleverness can permanently outrun legitimate authority. That is not wise, and it is not durable. What interests me is something better. Reduce unnecessary visibility. Reduce unnecessary concentration. Reduce unnecessary single-point dependence. Increase lawful control. Increase lawful redundancy. Increase directness where directness is sensible. Increase professional planning where planning is justified. Increase clarity. That is the real answer. The public swings between two childish extremes, either total faith in institutional smoothness or total fantasy about disappearing from the map. Maturity lives somewhere else. Maturity says, I will use institutions, but I will not depend on one institution for everything. I will own assets, but I will understand the legal geometry around them. I will benefit from tax wrappers, but I will not pretend wrappers are sovereignty. I will seek convenience, but I will not worship it. I will build a family balance sheet that still functions if one channel breaks, one institution slows, one platform freezes, or one rule changes. That is a sane household plan. The first practical principle is multiple rails. Life should not depend on one bank, one brokerage, one exchange, one card network, one advisor, one legal blind spot, or one account type. A person does not need 20 institutions. He does need enough separation that one interruption does not become total dependence. A checking account for ordinary operations. A separate institution for secondary liquidity. Short-term government paper held directly or through well-understood channels. Emergency cash for short-term frictions. Retirement assets in their place. Taxable investments in their place. Proper records of everything. The purpose is not to be dramatic. The purpose is to be boringly hard to trap. The second principle is visibility discipline. You do not need to advertise strength for strength to exist. One of the oldest pieces of practical wisdom in the world is that obvious wealth attracts attention, pressure, and nonsense. I do not only mean criminals, I mean the whole ecosystem of people and institutions that respond differently once they know there is something worth reaching for. The loudest display of surplus is usually a poor risk management decision. This does not mean living like a frightened fugitive. It means understanding that signal has consequences. A conspicuously expensive life often creates legal, social, tax, and psychological attention that a quieter life avoids. Quiet has value. That is one reason I have always preferred substance to theater. The third principle is documentation and counsel. People hate paying for good tax advice, estate advice, trust advice, property law advice, and serious review of title beneficiary and account structure, because these things do not feel like return. But return is not only what shows up in a bull market. Return is also what never has to be lost because a foolish or lazy structure was allowed to remain in place. A well-planned trust arrangement, correct titling, clean beneficiary designations, updated estate documents, proper insurance, properly understood exemptions, and competent tax review may look like administrative housekeeping. They are not housekeeping, they are defense. A household that spends years building assets but refuses to spend modest money understanding how those assets are legally and operationally held is behaving like a man who installs a vault door on a house with no foundation. That is not prudence. The fourth principle is liquidity with purpose. I want liquidity that is not just visible in the account but usable under stress. That means distinguishing between cash for spending, cash for emergencies, capital for investing, and capital for future income. Too many people treat all dollars as one blob, then become shocked when life forces them to liquidate the wrong asset at the wrong time. An emergency reserve exists so long. Term assets do not have to solve short-term shocks. Access redundancy exists, so a temporary hold or delay does not become a household crisis. That is what proper liquidity is for. Not looking rich, remaining functional. The fifth principle is understanding the difference between asset value and asset reachability. A fully paid house has value, but that value may not be liquid. A retirement account has value, but it may be policy shaped. A bank balance has value, but it may be operationally fragile if concentrated. Exchange-held digital wealth has value, but it may be contingent on platform behavior. Physical assets have value, but custody and documentation still matter. Once you think this way, you stop bragging about balances and start asking harder, better questions. How fast can this become useful? Who can interrupt access? What conditions change the answer? What legal or operational assumptions am I making? Most people do not think this way because modern finance trains them to admire smoothness. Smoothness is pleasant. It can also be misleading. A smooth app does not mean smooth sovereignty. A neat statement does not mean strong control. A famous brand name does not mean frictionless access under pressure. And a lifetime of normalcy does not mean the next emergency will care about the habits of the previous decade. This is why I think the real line separating fragile wealth from resilient wealth is not the number. It is the architecture. A family with a modest balance sheet and good architecture may be much stronger than a family with a large balance sheet and naive concentration. I have seen that often. The public admires scale. I admire structure. Structure decides whether scale survives trouble. There is one more point that matters deeply. Do not mistake private fear for private wisdom. The answer is not to rush into every rumor, every exotic shelter, every secretive scheme, every illegal concealment fantasy, or every dramatic story told by people who profit from panic. Panic is just greed wearing darker clothes. A frightened household can make foolish choices as easily as an overconfident one. The right response is not hysteria. It is disciplined decentralization, thoughtful planning, lawful separation of functions, concentration reduction, proper counsel, and a constant awareness that the biggest risk in financial life is often not market volatility, but dependency, hidden inside convenience. Dependency is easy to ignore because normal times make it feel efficient. But if you want a resilient life, you should distrust anything that works beautifully only while every gatekeeper remains cheerful. That standard alone will improve many balance sheets. If I had to reduce everything I have said to a few simple truths, it would sound like this. Do not build a life that can be halted by one institution. Do not confuse a statement balance with sovereign control. Do not let convenience be your only asset protection philosophy. Do not keep all strategic liquidity visible in one place and then call that safety. Do not assume future rules will always resemble current rules closely enough to justify concentrated passivity. And do not become so theatrical in response that you abandon legality, common sense, and proper counsel. The serious investor lives between two mistakes. The first mistake is complacency. The second is paranoia. Complacency says everything will function smoothly because it always has. Paranoia says no system can be trusted at all. Both are forms of laziness. Reality asks more from you. Reality says use the system intelligently, but respect its power. Take what is useful from institutions, but do not own directly where direct ownership matters. Spread where spreading reduces fragility. Document what you have. Understand the rules, review the structure, keep enough liquidity outside any single choke point that your household remains calm. If friction appears, that is not a fringe philosophy, that is stewardship. And stewardship is what serious money requires. In calm times, stewardship looks boring. In stress times, it looks like intelligence. I have always preferred to look a little too careful in easy periods rather than discover in a hard period that I had been calling permissions, ownership, and convenience resilience. That is the real lesson here. The most dangerous assets in a crisis are often not the most volatile ones. They are the ones you thought you owned completely, but in truth owned only conditionally. Once you see that, your whole balance sheet changes shape. You stop asking only what is my return. You start asking what is my control. And that is the beginning of adult financial thinking, because wealth is not only what belongs to you on paper. Wealth is what remains usable, reachable, and protective. When the system gets nervous, that is the standard I trust. It is the standard I would build around. And if a household does that well, it does not need to hide from the future. It simply becomes much harder for the future to corner.